right, guys, so now that World War II is all wrapped up, we of course have to discuss what is going to happen immediately after. So today's topic is really what happens immediately after the war, but as you'll see from the notes, it kind of extends all the way until actually the 1980s. So buckle down, we're covering a lot of history today. So to start off, we talked about rationing and how that was a big part of World War II memories. What do people from this time period remember? Here we go.
Duck and cover. Get away from the windows. Take cover and await further instructions.
So, even though the United States certainly emerges as a massive world power after this entire time period, because, the nuclear weapons and all kind of made us unforgettable, the thing that most people will remember in the decade following will be these duck and cover drills. So, what I just played for you is this actual toy, which would be terrifying for any child. But nonetheless, the toy gives a duck and cover warning, which is what students during the late 1940s and 1950s, and honestly, again, on until even in some cases the 80s, something they practice. So you guys are used to these kind of uncomfortable drills, where we go to a shelter in place and things like that. During this time period, what students were worried about were basically nuclear weapons being dropped near their school. So they would practice these duck and cover drills in which they would go underneath desks or hide in the hallways and be in preparation of that. So if you can imagine, which I really don't want to, but if you try to imagine it, it's pretty terrifying. So with the war wrapping up, we have these two major conferences because similar to World War I, where we had the Treaty of Versailles, we've got to wrap it up with, a nice little document, a little bow, and get everyone sign in, shake hands, and so on and so forth. So the first conference we're going to mention, and I'm going to post this in just a simple slide presentation so you can go over it at your own pace. But the first conference was this one, the Yalta Conference, and this one actually took place before the war even ended. So it's kind of all the big wigs coming, sitting down, and trying to decide, when the war ends, how should we handle it, which would hopefully make this conference a lot easier. So this is the Potsdam Conference. You can see, unfortunately, Roosevelt had passed away by this time, so Truman is taking his place there. And this discusses kind of one of our major issues for today's class. So again, just read those notes in detail, and we're going to chit-chat about them right now. So the big change after World War II is obviously Germany, couldn't be trusted. They wanted to make sure that Germany didn't have this totalitarian issue again, and they wanted to basically babysit Germany and make sure that it developed properly after World War II. So what they decided to do is divide it into 4 parts. So you can see they're labeled here, we divided it amongst the big 4 powers from World War II. And each of these countries were going to basically babysit these sections of Germany and make sure that it developed properly. So one thing I want to point out, because we're going to talk about this a little bit later, this dot is Berlin. So you can see the capital, which they are also going to divide into 4 sections, is actually in this Soviet Union section. That's going to play a big role a little later on in what we're chit-chatting about. So here you go, you have your 4 sections, and we're all kind of watching them and making sure it develops properly. Unfortunately, if you know your history, even a little bit of it, this doesn't go well. So immediately after World War II, we barely had a moment to breathe and enjoy the peace before conflict begins. And this time, the conflict is going to be with Big Bad Red here. So you can see it's labeled Communist Bloc on this particular map. And also what you should notice is this is the Soviet Union here. This is not, but this is also going to play a big role in what happens during this Cold War time period after World War II ends. So we're focusing on this section of Germany, which again was divided up into 4, but I'm also going to throw on my sad face. Soon after the war is over, the Soviet Union basically goes rogue. They decide during this time period that they're the ones who want the power in the world, and they are going to, I don't know how to word it. They don't officially take over these territories, but they highly influenced in a threatening way these areas, and they kind of claim them as their own. They remain their own countries, but the Soviet Union kind of claims them as their own, and we refer to them in history as satellite states that the Soviet Union forcefully watched over, if you will. And my sad face, of course, is over Poland, because poor Poland, man. I know I'm biased with my own family history, but they just can never catch a break in these decades of history. So we're going to continue talking about that in a moment, but to wrap up a couple of other issues from the 40s and 50s, after World War II, we also hold something called the Nuremberg trials. So hopefully you'll get to watch that in the Flipgrid later when we do our presentations from your research papers. And essentially, these were just these highly watched trials to find out who did what wrong during World War II. So all the major villains, for lack of a better word, were put on trial, and you can see some of the details there. Of course, unfortunately, not everyone was captured, which we mentioned during the spiel about Hitler's death. Some definitely escaped and never came to trial. But this is a big moment in history for sure. Another positive thing that actually came out of World War II is something we still have today, the United Nations. So if you remember, we had the League of Nations, which was a very similar concept. This one, I would argue, maybe was just a little more well thought out, maybe learned a little bit more from the mistakes of World War I and the League of Nations. This one, hopefully you all recognize, we actually still have today. So the United Nations was, as it says on the right in front of your faces, was this peace organization, which again still exists today. Some people have their issues with it and whatnot, and that's for your own research to try to figure out. I'm actually going to include the link to the website for you. I highly recommend you go to it. It is a pretty cool thing to at least learn about. I know I had the privilege of going to the United Nations once in New York, and it really is like stepping into another country, because once you walk in there, you hear all these different languages. You see people in, just cultural attire from different countries, and it's just such a blend of different worlds and different cultures. It's really pretty cool. And if you go to one of their meetings or lectures, they give you these awesome little headphones that you can put on, and you can click on any language in the world and it gets translated for you, so you can hear what the meetings are all about. So it's a pretty cool experience. Look into it one day. So this is kind of the big topic. After World War II ends, we fall into something that we refer to as the Cold War. So this, you definitely want to read over slowly on your own time. The biggest thing as an 8th grader going on into high school, to make sure that you don't embarrass yourselves, is to know that the war was neither cold, has nothing to do with temperature, and it has nothing, and it's not actually a war. There was no physical battle. It does come close to it, and that's why we refer to it as a war, because it was almost like at any moment war could break out between the United States, stop doing that, and the Soviet Union. So it was this like constant fear of war. And of course, this time around, and this is where the fear came from, this amount of time. So it was a long time that we lived in this fearful mentality. And of course, it wasn't even just about war this time. It was about nuclear war. It was about the race to build these destructive weapons. And so the fear of war with these duck and cover drills and everything made it even worse for the entire world, to be perfectly honest. So definitely no, it wasn't actually cold, and it wasn't actually a war. It lasted numerous decades. So this goes on for a very, very long time. And it all had to do with this battle over the spread of communism. So you just saw on the previous map that Stalin took it upon himself to create these satellite states, right? Taking over those neighboring countries and, persuasively, forcefully turning them into communist nations. And for the United States of America, if you remember when we studied the different government types, this was a big deal, because communism is pretty much against everything that the American way is all about. The idea of liberties and freedom and capitalism and free choice and free speech. Communism tends to take all of that away. So here's a very famous expression. It actually becomes a historical term that you should all know, the Iron Curtain. So as Churchill visually described, when Stalin took over those satellite states, it was as if an iron curtain had descended across the continent. So with this Iron Curtain, with the satellite states, with the spread of communism, there becomes an isolation of these things. The satellite states are now isolated from the world because of Stalin and the future communist leaders in these ways. So here's another map to visually show this. So again, similar to the Cold War, this is the Iron Curtain, which was neither iron nor an actual curtain. It's just an invisible boundary, which shows us where the communist states begin and where the free countries begin. So Yugoslavia, not to confuse you, keep it out of the picture, they were communist by choice. They were not part of the USSR's satellite takeover. So they're on the map too. But our concern was with these guys because, again, they didn't really choose communism. They're kind of being threatened, if you will, by the Soviet Union at this point in time. So this takeover had to do with the beginning of the Cold War, the spread of communism, and the expression that Churchill created was called the Iron Curtain. So I'm not going to read through these items with you. This is part of your own personal study for today. But there are 4 additional topics I want you to look into, and I just put the briefest of notes up on the board. If you need to extend your research on these topics, feel free to do so. But here are some of the things that came out of this immediate World War II time period. So number 1 is the Truman Doctrine, which we're going to talk about a little bit in a second, but if you haven't checked for my visuals, it has to do with money. So a way that we were trying to keep peace in the world was basically by using our money, our aid to other countries, to influence countries to make the right choices and, not lean towards communism, to be perfectly honest. Then you had something called the Marshall Plan. This was similar to mistakes made in World War I to make sure that other countries stayed financially stable so that they didn't turn to things like fascism or communism to help them gain prosperity. So keep countries financially healthy and they'll make healthier political decisions, I guess. The Berlin Airlift, which is pretty simply described here, but it has to do with what we had just discussed with not only Germany being divided into 4 sections, but with Berlin, the capital, also being divided into the 4 sections, being babysat by Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. So the problem with this is that, again, the capital, which we are babysitting, is stuck in the middle of the Soviet Union side of, that was the school calling, by the way. It is right in the middle of the Soviet Union babysat area. So this is where the Berlin Wall is going to come into play, and we'll show a little video of that. So as you can imagine, this whole area is now communist, this light tan area. And these 3 sections, this half of Berlin, which is going to all become one because we're going to decide to share it all together. This is the only free area in this Soviet Union territory. So the Soviet Union was very unhappy that we had all these freedoms here and people wanted to move here and work here because we know freedom rocks. So they built the Berlin Wall to prevent people literally from passing over. And so I'm going to include a little video for you guys to watch about that today. But also just check this out. This is one of the terrifying moments of the Berlin Wall. Well, not the Berlin Wall going up, but this division between that whole section of Berlin where pretty much the Soviet Union was starving out the free section. So we had to provide this airlift to help those people. So, where'd I go? So we're going to go back here. So we got NATO here. That's the next topic I wanted you guys to check out. So you may have heard of this one before. It does still exist today. It's one of those things Trump talks about. Does he love it? Does he hate it? So this was an important organization that came about that kind of bonded these countries after the whole World War II time period. So we're going to wrap up with a heartfelt story. This one's crazy because this girl is 13 years old and she was growing up throughout the 70s with all the fear of the duck and cover drills. Now, what have you guys done lately to change the world? This little girl actually shared her fears of the impending possibility of a nuclear war by writing a letter to the leader of the Soviet Union. And apparently had such an impact that they invited her to the Soviet Union to discuss her fears. And it kind of was this wonderful, peaceful moment in the world where the Soviet leader actually told her, don't worry about you and your family. We don't want a nuclear war either. So it's amazing what you can do at just the age of 13. And the last thing is, since we're talking about communism, the question always comes up. So I'm going to assume you're asking me it. What countries are still communist today? And technically speaking, these 4 are listed as communist nations. I have North Korea on there. They've declared themselves socialist, but I know based on some of the things we've talked about earlier in the year with Kim Jong-un and such, we kind of still see them as running themselves as communist. So hopefully you remember, politics is tricky. No one country is usually in one category or the other, which is what makes the topic difficult. But nonetheless, in today's world, those 4 label themselves as communists. So here's your wrap up. And I'll leave the directions for you guys in Google Classroom. And that'll be it for me today. Please, please, please let me know if you have any questions, because I know I did leave a lot of this stuff for your own independent review. And I'm going to leave you guys some videos and other resources. Hopefully the Google Forms will help indicate whether you understand what's going on today. But if you don't, please don't hesitate to contact me. If the 8 a.m. meet is too early for you, throw me a time and we'll work it out, guys. Miss y'all. Bye.